There's a forest out near Clinton County, Pennsylvania, that people tend not to talk much about, especially the older folks. You might get a warning if you mention hiking around in those woods or camping overnight. They don't really give you specifics, just a look and a suggestion. Don't. And if you do, don't stay out there after dark. My story happened in the late fall of 2014 when I was 23. I'd gotten into a habit that year of going on long weekend hikes, usually alone, through the less traveled trails of central Pennsylvania. I loved that early morning chill, the silence of the trees, and the way the mist rolled low along the leaves like the forest was exhaling. That November, I drove out to a remote stretch just past Heiner Run State Park. I'd been told about a lesser-known trail by a friend who worked for the Department of Conservation. He'd mentioned it offhand while talking about how dense the woods get out that way, even joking that people say the trees close in if you stay long enough. I didn't think much of it. I liked isolation. The more remote, the better. I arrived just after noon and started on a narrow footpath that branched off from an old logging road. The leaves were already deep gold and rust, and they crunched satisfyingly underfoot. The air was colder than I expected, and there were no other cars parked at the pull-off. That was fine by me. The hike in was uneventful for the first couple of hours. I saw a few deer, some fresh scat that might have belonged to a black bear, and heard the occasional woodpecker knocking somewhere deep in the trees. But around mid-afternoon, maybe 3:30, I found something odd. There was a clearing. Not large, maybe 20 feet across, but it was perfectly circular. Dead leaves covered the forest floor everywhere except that patch, which was just bare dirt. At the center of the circle, a tree had been cut down years ago, leaving only a wide, moss-covered stump. Around it were small stone formations, stacked rocks, maybe 6 or 7 inches high, in little piles all around the perimeter. They looked intentionally placed, not natural at all. Something about it made my skin crawl. It wasn't just strange, it felt off. Like walking into a room after an argument, the air somehow heavier. I didn't like the idea of turning back, though, and I didn't see any obvious reason to be afraid. Maybe it was some kind of ritual site or just a place kids used for parties. Still, I didn't linger. I snapped a picture, marked the location on my GPS, and moved on. As I walked, the trees got thicker, their branches intertwining overhead until the trail was in near perpetual shadow. I'd planned to camp overnight, set up a lightweight tent, and cook over a small fire, but as I pressed deeper into the woods, the idea became less appealing. By 5, the light was fading fast. I found a spot just off the trail, a small rise near a ridge, with a fallen log nearby that I could sit on to eat. I pitched the tent quickly and made a small fire, just enough for warmth and some instant rice and jerky. It was quiet out there. Too quiet. Forests at night usually have some sound, wind through the branches, the occasional owl, crickets, but once the sun dipped below the horizon, it was like someone had put a blanket over the entire place. My ears strained to hear anything. I couldn't even hear the wind. That silence was what really got under my skin. It wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the woods were waiting for something. I tried to shake the unease and focused on eating. Around 7, I doused the fire and crawled into my tent. I left the rain flap open so I could look out through the mesh. The moon wasn't up yet, and the darkness was thick and absolute. It was like someone had dropped ink all over the forest. I was drifting to sleep when I heard it, branches snapping. Not a deer, not squirrels. Heavy. Deliberate. I held my breath. Another crack. Closer this time. Whatever it wasn't rushing through. It was moving slowly, cautiously. I reached for the small hunting knife I kept near my sleeping bag and sat up, straining to hear. The noise stopped, and then, right outside the tent, I heard breathing. It was low, raspy, not the exhale of a deer. It sounded human, but wrong, too loud, too guttural, like someone with fluid in their lungs. I didn't dare move. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would give me away. The breathing continued for maybe a minute, then stopped abruptly. The silence returned. I don't remember falling asleep. I must have passed out from fear or exhaustion. When I woke up, it was just after dawn. The woods were still and cold, but I noticed something immediately. My boots, which I'd left just outside the tent's flap, were gone. I found them 10 feet away, side by side, pointing toward the trail. That made no sense. I always put them just outside the flap. I even remember placing them there, and now they were moved, like someone had taken them, studied them, and put them back, facing the path I came from. I packed up fast. I didn't eat. I didn't stop to check my map. I just wanted to get out of there. About an hour into the hike back, I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. My footprints from the day before, except there were others alongside them. Not animal prints, bare human feet, larger than mine. Long toes, spaced far apart like whoever made them had a wide gait. They followed mine exactly, step for step, and at some point, they veered off into the woods, just vanished. I didn't stop moving. My eyes scanned every patch of undergrowth, every dark gap between trees. I swear I saw movement in the corner of my eye more than once, but every time I turned, there was nothing. Then I found the clearing again. Except this time, the little stone formations were gone. All of them. And the stump in the center? There was something on it now. A bundle of sticks and cloth like a crude doll. Tied together with twine, stuffed into the head was a tuft of dark brown hair. I didn't look closely. I didn't want to know. I practically ran the last stretch of trail, ignoring the burning in my legs and the stitch in my side. I reached my car, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I got to Lock Haven. For days after, I felt watched. My apartment felt wrong. I'd wake up in the middle of the night certain someone had been in the room. Once I came home from work to find muddy footprints, bare, long-toed, on the carpet just inside my front door. I stopped hiking for a long time after that. I told a friend, same one who'd originally told me about the trail, and he looked pale. He said there are rumors about that forest. Old stories. Something about a man who lived out there in the 1800s, a hermit who lost his mind after his family died in a fire. They say he started performing strange rituals, claiming he could speak to the forest. Then he vanished, just disappeared. People said he became part of the woods. Some think he still walks there, or something wearing his shape does. My friend wouldn't say more. I still have that picture of the clearing on my phone. I don't know why I haven't deleted it. Maybe some part of me wants proof that it was real, that I didn't dream it. But I'll never go back there, not even in daylight. The woods are beautiful, but not all of them are safe. Some places don't want you there. Some places wait for you. And when you sleep in their shadows, they look back. Story the end. The forest was supposed to be my refuge. After the chaos of the city, the noise, the crowds, the endless glare of screens, I wanted nothing more than to escape. So when my friend Jake invited me to join him on a weekend camping trip, I jumped at the chance. He promised a quiet spot deep in the woods of a national forest, far from cell service and other campers. Just us, the stars, and the trees, he said with a grin. We packed light, tents, sleeping bags, a couple of flashlights, and enough food for 2 days. We drove until the pavement ended, then bounced down a dirt road that narrowed and twisted through tall pines. At some point, Jake stopped and pointed to a faint trail, barely wide enough for one person. This is it. From here, it's all footpaths. I was excited. I wanted to get away from everything. We hiked for nearly 2 hours, the forest thickening around us. The tall trees towered like silent sentinels, their branches forming a dense canopy that filtered the afternoon light into shards of green and gold. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, sharp and fresh. Birds sang, and somewhere nearby, water babbled over stones. Eventually, we found a clearing, a perfect spot by a small creek. Jake set up the tents while I gathered some firewood. We talked about work, life, and old memories. The sun slipped behind the trees, and the forest began to darken. That night, we built a fire and roasted hot dogs, laughing at silly stories and joking about the wild animals that might be watching us. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows, and the stars peeked through the gaps in the canopy overhead. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd hoped for. As I lay in my sleeping bag later, I heard the usual forest sounds. Crickets, an owl hooting, leaves rustling in a soft breeze. The night was cool but comfortable, and I was almost asleep when I thought I heard something else. A snapping twig very close. I opened my eyes, staring into the blackness beyond the tent fabric. Maybe a deer or a raccoon. Nothing to worry about, but then I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, stepping carefully on dry leaves just outside the tent. "Jake," I whispered, nudging him. He mumbled but didn't wake. The footsteps circled the tent, pausing at the far side, then moving away slowly. I stayed awake, heart pounding. When morning came, Jake laughed at my nervousness. "You're just not used to the woods at night," he said. "It's probably a raccoon or something." We hiked around, the sun warm on our backs. Still, something felt off. That afternoon, we went down to the creek to refill our water bottles. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. I looked around and saw that the trees seemed to close in tighter here, their shadows darker and heavier. Jake stepped into the water and started whistling. I stared at the woods opposite the creek, where the trees were thick and tangled. Then I saw it, a figure, pale, standing among the trees. At first, I thought it was Jake playing a trick, but it didn't move. I blinked. The figure vanished. "Did you see that?" I asked Jake. "See what?" he said, smiling. I shook my head. "Never mind." That night, I didn't sleep well. The footsteps came again, closer this time. There was a tapping on the tent, light but persistent, like fingers drumming on fabric. I unzipped the tent flap carefully, peering into the dark. No one. Just shadows and silence. But the smell hit me first, a faint scent of something metallic and cold, like rusted iron. The fire was low, and the stars obscured by clouds. I closed the flap and lay awake. Around midnight, the tapping returned, this time from the other side of the tent. I grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam landed on a small clearing, trap, and for a brief second I saw a pair of eyes reflecting back. Not animal eyes. They were human, but empty, hollow. The figure crouched low, then slipped back into the darkness. I woke Jake again, shaking him. "There's someone out there," I whispered. He sat up, grabbing his flashlight and the hatchet he'd brought along. We stayed awake, watching the fire and scanning the woods. The tapping stopped. No footsteps. In the morning, I found strange marks on the tent. Scratches, shallow but arranged in a pattern I didn't understand. We packed quickly and decided to hike back. The forest felt different, heavier somehow, as if it was watching us leave. On the trail back, Jake joked to lighten the mood, but I wasn't convinced. When we reached the dirt road where we parked the car, something on the ground caught my eye. A small, twisted branch arranged in a circle with bits of moss and dried leaves inside. I picked it up, heart thudding. It felt cold and heavy. Back home, I tried to dismiss everything as nerves, but the feeling followed me. That cold stare in the dark, the tapping, the marks. I looked up local reports, hoping to find something about campers disappearing or forest legends. There were stories, but vague and old. Some about spirits that guard the forest, others about people who get lost forever. I never went back. Sometimes at night, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear tapping on my window. And I never forget those empty eyes. Story the end. The first time I went camping alone in the forest was just after I turned 25. I'd grown up in a small town surrounded by woods, but I'd always gone with friends or family, never by myself. That trip was supposed to be a quiet getaway from everything. No phones, no distractions, just me and the trees for 3 days. I had a small tent, some basic supplies, and a map of the area printed from the state park website. I'd picked a spot on the edge of a large national forest, far enough away from the main trails to avoid other campers, but close enough that I wouldn't get lost. The first day was peaceful. The sun filtered through the leaves, casting golden light on the forest floor. I hiked a few miles, found a small creek to fill my water bottle, and set up camp before dusk. The sounds of birds and insects made a soft soundtrack, and by nightfall I was warm by my small campfire. I cooked some canned chili and settled into my sleeping bag. I fell asleep with the fire's glow fading to embers, the gentle rustling of leaves lulling me. Around midnight, something woke me. At first, I thought it was the wind or a small animal brushing past the tent, but then I heard a distinct sound, footsteps, slow, deliberate, outside the tent. Not the crunch of twigs or leaves, but heavy thuds, almost like someone stomping softly on the forest floor. I froze. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, moving close but not threatening. The footsteps circled the tent, not fast, not running away, just slow and pacing. The crunching passed from one side of the tent to the other, then stopped. Silence. I lay awake the rest of the night, gripping my flashlight and a pocket knife. When morning came, I checked around the campsite but found no signs of footprints or disturbance. The ground was soft from a recent rain, so I expected to see something if someone had been there, but the dirt was untouched except for my own tracks. I laughed nervously to myself, probably just my imagination or the wind messing with shadows. The next day, I decided to explore a little further from camp. The map showed a narrow trail winding through the forest, leading to a small waterfall about 3 miles away. The trail was overgrown, and I had to push past thick brush and tangled vines. At one point, I thought I heard voices in the distance, but there was no one around when I stopped and listened. The forest felt oddly quiet, too quiet. When I reached the waterfall, I sat on a moss-covered rock and took out a granola bar. The water crashed down in a steady rush, making a loud white noise that filled the clearing. For a few minutes, I just breathed it in, feeling a strange calmness. But then I noticed something strange near the base of the falls. On a flat rock, partially hidden by ferns, was a small bundle wrapped in a torn piece of cloth. I hesitated, then pulled it out. It was a child's doll, dirty and waterlogged, with one eye missing. A chill ran through me. How had this ended up here? No one else was supposed to be hiking this trail. I looked around for a sign of someone, parents, campers, anyone, but there was nothing. I wrapped the doll back up and left it where it was. I didn't want to touch something that felt so out of place. On the way back, the silence deepened. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. I kept glancing behind me, but I saw no movement. I reached my camp as the sun dipped low in the sky. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they weren't just circling the tent. They were closer, almost at the edge of the fabric. I held my breath, waiting. Then I heard a soft tapping, like someone gently drumming their fingers on the tent's wall. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it out the tent's window, but the beam hit only darkness. I whispered, "Who's there?" No answer, just the tapping. Then the footsteps faded into the distance. I didn't sleep much after that. I stayed awake, listening for any sound. I told myself to stay calm, that I was alone and safe, but fear settled in my chest like a stone. The third day, I packed up early. I wanted to get back to civilization, to the safety of my car and the noisy streets. But before I left, I decided to walk once more toward the clearing near the waterfall. When I arrived, the doll was gone. In its place was a small pile of dirt, shaped roughly like a mound. I knelt and brushed my fingers over it, feeling a strange heaviness. My skin crawled, and I felt eyes watching me from the trees. I turned and hurried back to camp, breaking into a run. As I passed the creek, I stopped to refill my water bottle, but the water looked strange, dark and murky, like ink. I shook my head and told myself to stop imagining things. I made it back to camp without incident, loaded my gear, and started the long hike to my car. The forest seemed to press in on me, the shadows stretching like fingers across the trail. Just as the sun was setting, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they weren't slow or tentative. They were running. Fast. I broke into a sprint, my breath ragged, heart pounding. I didn't look back, but I could hear the pounding getting closer. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I forced myself to keep going. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. Silence again. I slowed to a walk, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. No sounds but my own breathing. I reached the parking lot as the last light faded from the sky. The forest behind me was dark and silent once more. When I got home, I tried to tell my friends what happened, but they laughed it off. "Just animals," they said. "Your imagination." But I never went back to that forest. Sometimes on quiet nights, I still hear tapping on my bedroom window, slow and deliberate. Story the end. The sun was already low in the sky when I pulled my old Jeep off the narrow gravel road and into the clearing beside the forest trailhead. It was early October. The air was crisp and the leaves were beginning to turn, shades of amber, rust, and gold glowing under the fading daylight. I had been planning this solo camping trip for months, craving the kind of quiet you only find far from city noise and neon lights. I wanted nothing but the sound of the wind in the trees and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. The parking lot was empty except for one other vehicle, an older pickup truck with faded paint and rust streaks. I assumed the driver was somewhere ahead on the trail. I grabbed my pack, double-checked my gear, and set off down the narrow path, the crunch of leaves underfoot blending with distant birdsong. The forest felt alive, but peaceful, nothing unusual for a place I'd visited before. About 2 miles in, the trail crossed a shallow creek. I knelt on the mossy bank, cupped my hands, and drank the cold, clear water. The sun was dipping lower now, and a chill began to settle in the air. I knew I'd need to find a good spot to set up camp soon. Not far from the creek, I found a small clearing surrounded by towering pines and birches. It was perfect, soft, level ground, and sheltered from the wind by a dense ring of trees. I set down my pack, unpacked my tent, and began gathering firewood. The light was fading fast, but I wanted to have a fire going before dark. As I worked, I noticed something odd, a faint scent in the air. Something earthy, but a little bitter, like burnt leaves mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. I shrugged it off, maybe the season or the dampness from the creek. By the time the sun had fully disappeared, I had a small fire crackling and a pot of stew simmering over it. I sat back against a log, the warmth from the fire a comfort against the creeping cold. The forest was settling into the night, and with it came the usual chorus of crickets and frogs. I pulled out my flashlight and started reading a book I'd brought, but the words blurred quickly as my eyes adjusted to the dark. I felt a strange tension creeping in, like I was being watched. I told myself it was just the isolation, that my imagination was getting the better of me. Then I heard it, a soft tapping. At first I thought it was a branch knocking against another, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on wood. I looked around, shining my flashlight toward the trees, but saw nothing. The tapping stopped. I shook my head, trying to laugh off the nerves, and crawled into my tent to sleep. Hours later, I was awakened by a rustling just outside. I froze, heart pounding. The tapping began again, slow and methodical. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire had burned low to glowing embers, barely casting light beyond a few feet. My flashlight was inside, on the log beside the tent. I wanted to call out, to tell whoever or whatever was out there to leave me alone. But my voice caught in my throat. The tapping moved closer. Step by step, a slow, dragging sound joined it. I fumbled for my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness and landed on something tall and thin, standing just at the edge of the clearing. Its shape was humanoid, but unnaturally elongated, limbs bent at odd angles. The face, if it could be called that, was pale and blurred in the shadows, but its eyes glowed faintly in the flashlight's glare. I screamed and scrambled back into the tent, pulling the zipper tight. The tapping stopped. The forest returned to silence. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't care that the stew was still warm or that I hadn't even tried to fish in the creek. I wanted out. On my way back, I spotted the pickup truck again, parked at the trailhead. The driver was gone. Driving back, the roads felt longer, the trees closing in on me. Weeks later, I tried to tell my friends what happened, but they said I was probably just overtired or imagining things. Maybe they were right, but I never went back. And sometimes when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear tapping at the window. Quiet, patient, waiting. Story the end. The forest had always been a place of refuge for Laura, a place where she could escape the noise of her busy life and the stress of a demanding job. She was an experienced hiker and camper, having grown up near woodlands, and though she hadn't been out in the wild for some time, she felt ready for a weekend alone. The spot she chose was a remote section of the Black Hills National Forest, an area she had visited years ago with friends but had never explored solo. On a crisp Friday morning in late October, Laura set out early with her backpack loaded with essentials: a tent, a sleeping bag, enough food for 3 days, a compass, and a map. No phone service was expected here, and that was exactly the point. She wanted the solitude. The sun was shining through the thinning leaves, casting long shadows on the forest floor as she made her way along a narrow dirt trail that quickly became overgrown in places. The first day passed uneventfully. She walked several miles, passing small streams and rocky outcrops, the quiet punctuated only by birdsong and the rustle of squirrels gathering acorns. Laura felt an old peace settling over her. She set up camp near a small clearing beside a creek where the water moved sluggishly over mossy stones. She made a fire, cooked a simple meal, and crawled into her tent as the temperature dropped sharply. That night, the forest was alive with sounds she'd almost forgotten. The wind whispered through the pines, an owl hooted distantly, and somewhere a fox yipped. Laura felt cocooned by nature's presence. Around midnight, a faint noise stirred her from a light sleep. At first, she thought it was the wind, branches scraping against the tent's outer layer, but the sound was rhythmic and deliberate, not random. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It circled the tent, slow and measured. Laura's pulse quickened. She reached for her flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The beam caught nothing but the dark trunks of trees and the glint of dew on leaves. She called out softly, "Hello?" But no answer came. The scraping stopped. She zipped the tent closed and tried to calm her racing heart. Maybe a raccoon? Or a deer? Animals that late at night often move cautiously, especially around campsites. Sleep was elusive, and every shadow seemed to twitch. The silence pressed on her ears. Around 2 a.m., another sound disturbed the night. A low growl, deep and guttural. It wasn't an animal sound Laura recognized. It was close, just beyond the fire's reach. Her flashlight slipped from her trembling fingers. She sat frozen, the growl growing louder, mixed now with something that sounded like heavy breathing. Suddenly, a shape loomed outside the tent, blocking the light. Tall, humanoid but impossibly thin, its limbs awkward and elongated, as if its body wasn't meant to move the way it did. Its eyes, large and reflective, stared directly at her. Laura's mind screamed at her to run, but her body refused. The figure tilted its head slowly, as if studying her. She scrambled backwards inside the tent, fumbling for her knife. The creature didn't attack but vanished into the shadows as silently as it had come. The rest of the night was haunted by whispers, indistinct, half-heard voices that seemed to float on the wind. When dawn finally broke, Laura packed hurriedly, shaken but determined to get back to the trailhead. The hike back felt endless, every snapping twig and rustle sending jolts through her. She noticed marks on tree trunks, deep gouges, unnatural in their regularity. At one point, she stumbled upon an abandoned campsite, old and decayed, with strange symbols etched into stones arranged in a circle. Back in town, Laura spoke with a ranger who listened intently. The ranger mentioned locals' warnings about the Watchers of the Woods, a folklore about entities that protect certain sacred areas of the forest, punishing those who intrude. Laura never camped alone again, but sometimes in the dark silence of her apartment, she swears she hears scratching at her window, and in her dreams, those glowing eyes still watch. Story the end. It was the kind of forest that swallowed sound, the dense canopy of ancient pines and hardwoods pressing down so tightly that the sunlight barely kissed the forest floor. I found myself there one late October afternoon, pulled by a restless urge to get away from the noise of the city, from the endless hum of daily life. I was young, maybe 25, and had just started working at a small outdoor gear shop in Vermont. It was my first real solo trip. Just me, my pack, and a map that led to a trail few people talked about. I remember parking at the small dirt pull-off just before the trailhead, the smell of damp earth and pine needles thick in the air. The sky was heavy with clouds, the kind that promised rain, but I didn't care. I wanted the forest, raw and wild, not some manicured park with paved paths and picnic tables. My plan was simple. Hike in 5 miles, find a clearing, set up camp, and spend the night. The trail was narrow, overgrown in parts, winding beneath towering trees that stretched skyward like the ribs of some giant beast. I passed a small creek, its water clear but cold, and felt the weight of silence pressing in on me. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of something waiting. I arrived at a small clearing near a ridge just before dusk, a perfect spot with enough room for my tent and a small fire pit someone had made long ago. I set up camp quickly, gathering dry wood as the light faded and the forest grew darker. The wind picked up, sighing through the branches, and I built a fire to ward off the chill. As I sat by the flames eating some jerky and instant soup, I caught a glimpse of movement beyond the firelight. Something shifting in the shadows. I froze, my heart thudding. It was just a deer or a raccoon, I told myself, but the rustling didn't sound like an animal. It was heavier, more deliberate. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight. Nothing. The forest had grown quiet again. Too quiet. I decided to crawl into my tent early, hoping sleep would come fast. I zipped the door closed and lay on my sleeping pad, the fabric creaking softly under me. Outside, the fire had died to glowing embers, and the trees were nothing but silhouettes against the night sky. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow, deep, and labored. Right outside the tent. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to tell myself it was my imagination, that the forest was playing tricks. But the sound was real. Too real. I held perfectly still, clutching the small pocket knife I always carried. The breathing grew louder, closer, until I could feel it against the thin fabric of the tent wall. Then a whisper, low and ragged. Not safe. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice stuck somewhere deep in my chest. The breathing stopped. The forest fell silent again. Morning came with a pale light filtering through the trees. I unzipped the tent and stumbled out, cold and shaking. The fire pit was cold, the ashes scattered by the wind, but on the ground near my tent flap, I found something I didn't expect. A single muddy footprint, barefoot. It was large, wider than mine, with long toes splayed wide, and the print was pressed deeply into the soft earth. I wasn't alone out there. I packed up as fast as I could and took the trail back. My steps were quick, but every so often I looked behind, half expecting to see something, or someone following me. That footprint stayed in my mind for weeks after, haunting every shadow and quiet moment. I never found another trace, no sign of who or what it belonged to. But I know now that some forests don't want you there. Some nights, when the wind blows just right and the silence feels too thick, I hear that ragged breath again, whispering just beyond my door. Not safe. Story the end. The summer I turned 23, I decided to take some time off work and go camping alone in the national forest about 2 hours from my apartment. I'd always been comfortable in the woods. Growing up in a small town surrounded by trees, I had spent my childhood exploring trails, building small shelters, and learning to read nature's signs. Over the years, the forest became my refuge from the stress of life, and I often went hiking or camping with friends. But this trip was different. I wanted solitude. No distractions, no phones, no plans. I packed my gear carefully, taking only the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, some canned food, a water filter, and a good flashlight. I left a note for my roommate with the rough coordinates and expected return date. My plan was to hike about 8 miles into the forest to a clearing I had spotted on a map, set up camp, and spend 3 nights there. The drive was easy enough. I left early on a Friday morning, the sun already warm on my skin. When I arrived at the trailhead, there were a few other cars, but nothing crowded. I laced up my boots, slung my pack over my shoulder, and set off onto the trail. The forest was dense with towering pines, their trunks thick and bark rough beneath my fingertips as I passed. The air smelled of pine resin and damp earth. Birds called overhead, and now and then a squirrel chattered. I moved steadily, enjoying the rhythm of my feet on the soft dirt path. Around 2 hours in, the trail forked, and I took the left path as planned. It narrowed and grew less distinct, but the map showed a clearing just beyond. The deeper I walked, the quieter it became. Not just the usual forest quiet, this was different, the kind of silence where even the smallest sound seems magnified. By early afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was a wide, grassy patch surrounded by ancient trees, sunlight filtering through their branches like gold dust. Perfect. I set up my tent near the edge, close enough to the trees for shelter but open to the sky. As I arranged my camp, a strange feeling crept over me, like I was being watched. I shook it off, probably just the usual nerves of being alone in the wilderness. I spent the afternoon reading a book and collecting firewood. When night came, I lit a small fire and cooked some canned chili. The stars were brilliant, scattered across the sky like diamonds. I lay back on my sleeping pad and listened to the forest's night sounds, the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the distant howl of coyotes. Around midnight, I woke. The fire was just a pile of glowing embers. I had to pee, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside the tent. That's when I noticed it. The forest was darker than before, thicker somehow, like the shadows had grown heavier. And then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, reflecting the beam of my flashlight from the tree line around the clearing. They were low, maybe 2 or 3 feet off the ground, glowing an eerie yellow-green. My heart pounded. I tried to tell myself it was just deer or raccoons, but these eyes were too still, too numerous, and they didn't blink or move. I stepped back, heart racing, and suddenly the eyes vanished. I turned and hurried back inside my tent, zipped it up, and sat shaking for a long time. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was probably just an animal curiosity, maybe a family of raccoons. I fell asleep eventually, but the next night brought something worse. Around 3 a.m., I was jolted awake by a strange sound, a low humming, almost like a chant, drifting through the trees. I sat up, heart pounding again, and listened. The humming grew louder, surrounding the clearing. It was rhythmic, unsettling, almost hypnotic. I grabbed my flashlight and peeked outside the tent. The forest was empty, but the air felt thick as if charged with electricity. Suddenly, a figure stepped into the clearing. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, thin, wearing a dark cloak. But the closer it came, the more wrong that idea felt. The figure moved oddly, almost gliding without making a sound. My flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged through me as the humming intensified, echoing around me. I scrambled for my backup light, hands trembling. When it finally flicked on, the figure was gone. I never slept again that night. Morning felt like a blessing. I packed up my camp and started hiking out, eager to leave the place behind. But as I walked, the forest grew strangely silent again. No birds, no animals, no wind, just a thick stillness. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I stopped and turned. No one. I walked faster. The footsteps kept pace. I ran. Branches tore at my clothes. Roots snagged my feet. The footsteps echoed behind me. I burst out of the woods onto the trailhead road, heart hammering. That night, back in my apartment, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that humming, like it followed me home. Weeks later, I told a friend about the trip. He nodded, solemn. "You're lucky to be alive," he said. Turns out, that part of the forest was known locally for strange disappearances over the years. People sometimes spoke of a presence, a watcher that didn't like trespassers. I don't know what I saw or heard out there. I don't want to. But sometimes when the night is still and quiet, I swear I hear the humming again, just on the edge of hearing. And I wonder if it's waiting. Story the end. The first time I went into the forest alone was when I was 19. I needed a break from everything: school, family drama, constant noise. A friend recommended this remote patch of woods a few hours north of the city, a place where people rarely went and cell phones didn't work. It was supposed to be peaceful, a way to disconnect and maybe even find some clarity. I packed a small backpack, just water, snacks, a flashlight, and a notebook. I told my parents I was going on a day hike with a group from college, but I left early before anyone else woke up. The drive was long, winding through sleepy towns and then onto gravel roads that got bumpier the deeper I went. When I finally pulled over, the sun was just rising behind the trees, casting a dull orange glow on everything. The forest was dense, mostly pine with thick underbrush that crunched underfoot. I followed an old trail marked by a faded wooden sign nailed to a tree, but the path quickly grew narrow and twisted. After about an hour, I stopped to rest on a fallen log near a small stream. The air smelled like earth and pine needles, and the only sounds were bird song and the gentle rush of water. I pulled out my notebook and tried to write, but the words felt clumsy. So instead, I just sat and watched the forest move. Leaves fluttering, light shifting, shadows growing longer. It was calm, but something about it felt off, like the forest was watching me back. I shrugged it off and kept walking deeper into the woods. The trail became harder to follow, swallowed by fallen leaves and branches. At one point, I realized I was completely alone. No birds, no wind, nothing but a heavy, suffocating silence. Then I heard it, the faintest snap of a twig behind me. I froze, heart pounding. I told myself it was just an animal, like maybe a squirrel or a deer, but the feeling didn't go away. I turned slowly, shining my flashlight through the trees. Nothing. I kept walking, faster now, but the trail was disappearing. The forest looked unfamiliar. The trees were taller, their branches tangled like giant claws. I stopped again when I heard whispering. It was so soft I thought I imagined it, but it was definitely there, a low murmur coming from somewhere just beyond the trees. I called out, "Hello?" But my voice sounded small and scared. The whispering stopped. Then I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, moving just out of sight. I started to run, but the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees leaned closer, blocking the moonlight. Every step I took, the footsteps followed, always just behind me. Panic set in. I scrambled over roots and rocks, my breath ragged. Suddenly, the ground gave way beneath me, and I tumbled down a small embankment, landing hard on my side. When I looked up, the forest had changed. The trees here were blackened, charred as if from a fire long ago. The air was thick and heavy, smelling like smoke and ash. In the distance, I saw a figure standing among the burnt trunks. It was tall, thin, and pale, almost ghostly. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure didn't move, but stared at me with empty, dark eyes. Then it turned and disappeared into the shadows. I scrambled back up the embankment and ran blindly through the forest. Eventually, I broke through the trees into a clearing where an old cabin stood. The door hung open, creaking in the wind. I stepped inside, grateful for shelter. The cabin was empty except for a small table with a notebook and a pen. I picked it up and opened it. The pages were filled with messy handwriting, notes about strange occurrences in the forest, disappearances, voices, shadows. The last entry read, "They are watching. Don't trust the forest. Don't stay." Suddenly, I heard the door slam shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing. Outside, the whispering started again, louder this time, surrounding the cabin. I grabbed the notebook and ran out into the night. I didn't stop until I reached my car hours later, exhausted and terrified. Since then, I've learned the forest has a dark history. People vanish there every year, their bodies never found. Some say the forest is alive, feeding on fear and loneliness. Others believe something else lurks in the shadows, waiting. I never went back, and sometimes when the wind howls through the trees at night, I swear I hear that whispering again. Story, the end. The forest had always been a place of peace for me, a sanctuary where the noise of the city faded away and the rhythm of nature took over. Growing up near a small town surrounded by dense woods, I spent much of my childhood exploring the trails, climbing trees, and camping with friends. But there was always one area of the forest that people spoke about in hushed tones, a stretch of wilderness locals avoided once night fell. It wasn't marked on any map, and most dismissed the stories as folklore or overactive imaginations. Still, I'd heard enough to feel a cautious respect for it. One summer, after a tough year filled with stress from work and personal life, I decided to take a solo camping trip. I needed to clear my head, disconnect completely, and immerse myself in the woods. I planned to hike deep into the forest, farther than I'd ever gone before, to camp somewhere near an old logging trail I'd heard about from a retired park ranger. According to him, it was a beautiful spot beside a small creek, shaded by towering pines and rarely visited, perfect for solitude. I packed my gear carefully: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, a compass, and a first aid kit. I made sure my phone was fully charged, but planned to leave it off to avoid distractions. I left a note with my sister about where I was going and when I planned to return. The morning was clear and warm as I set out early, the sun just brushing the treetops. The forest welcomed me with its familiar smells of pine needles, damp earth, and wildflowers. The first few hours passed easily. I followed the trail, marked faintly with old paint blazes, stepping over roots and ducking under low branches. Birds sang intermittently, and squirrels darted up tree trunks. Around midday, I stopped by a small clearing to eat a sandwich and refill my water bottle from a creek. The water was cold and fresh, trickling over smooth stones. As I rested, I noticed something strange. The usual forest sounds, birds, insects, rustling leaves, had quieted almost completely. The clearing felt unnervingly silent, the kind of silence that sets your skin on edge. I shrugged it off, blaming the heat or maybe a passing thunderstorm moving in. I packed up and continued deeper into the woods. The logging trail was rougher and less traveled, with fallen branches and thick undergrowth crowding the edges. I had to stop several times to check my compass and make sure I wasn't veering off course. The further I went, the denser the forest became, the sunlight barely reaching the forest floor through the thick canopy. It was beautiful, but the quiet weighed on me. By late afternoon, I found the spot the ranger had described, a flat area near a narrow creek lined with moss-covered rocks. I set up my tent quickly and gathered firewood. As I worked, I noticed a faint path leading away from the creek, barely visible through the brush. It didn't look like an official trail, more like something animals or maybe a few hikers had used occasionally. I decided to follow it, curious to see where it led before nightfall. The path wound deeper into the forest, twisting between towering firs and crossing small ravines. After about 20 minutes, I came upon a strange sight. A circle of stones arranged carefully around a hollowed-out stump. In the center lay what looked like old pieces of cloth, faded and torn. I knelt down to inspect, but didn't touch anything. Something about the arrangement felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. A sudden chill ran through me, despite the warm weather. I stood quickly, heart beating faster, and headed back to camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as I reached my tent, casting long shadows through the trees. That night, I built a small fire and cooked some canned soup. The forest sounds had returned, but felt muted, distant. As I sat by the fire, I thought I heard faint footsteps somewhere beyond the tree line, too heavy to be an animal. I scanned the darkness with my flashlight, but saw nothing. Maybe it was just me getting spooked. I crawled into my tent and zipped it shut, trying to calm my nerves. I lay on my sleeping pad, listening to the crackle of the dying fire and the soft rustling of leaves. Just as I was drifting off, I heard it again, a slow, deliberate knocking on the side of my tent. I froze, eyes wide in the darkness. The knocking came 3 times, then stopped. I whispered, "Who's there?" But only silence answered me. My hand found my pocket knife, and I stayed alert until dawn, heart pounding. The first light of morning brought some relief, though I felt uneasy. I packed up quickly and started hiking back toward the main trail, eager to leave the isolated spot behind. As I moved, I noticed the forest seemed to shift. The trees felt closer, shadows deeper, and the silence heavier. The trail I had come in on was harder to follow. The path markers were missing or obscured, and my compass needle spun erratically. Panic crept in. I realized I was lost. I stopped to catch my breath and check my map. It made no sense. The terrain didn't match what I was seeing. I tried retracing my steps, but kept ending up at the same clearing with the stone circle. It was like the forest was rearranging itself, trapping me inside a maze. The sun was high, but the canopy blocked most of the light. A faint wind stirred the branches, and I thought I heard whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. I shook my head, telling myself it was the trees creaking or my imagination. Hours passed. I wandered, trying to stay calm and conserve energy. Then, as evening approached again, I came upon something new. Footprints. Not animal tracks, but human footprints, large and heavy, pressed into the soft earth. They were fresh and led deeper into the forest, away from the logging trail. I debated whether to follow them or stay put. But the thought of spending another night lost terrified me. I decided to follow the footprints, hoping they would lead to a ranger station or at least a clearer path. The footprints led me through thick brush and over fallen logs. At times I felt like I was being watched. Branches snapped behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. The forest grew darker, and a heavy fog began to roll in, muffling sounds and blurring the edges of the trees. After what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. In the middle stood an old cabin, like dilapidated and overgrown with vines. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. I hesitated, but stepped forward, calling out for help. No answer. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and rot. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling, and broken furniture lay scattered. On a dusty table, I found a journal. Its pages were yellowed and brittle, but I flipped through it carefully. The entries were dated over 100 years ago, written by a man who described strange happenings in the forest, disappearances, strange lights, and voices calling from the trees. One entry stood out. "They come for those who wander too far. The forest does not forget." A cold shiver ran down my spine. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching outside, heavy, slow steps. I ducked behind a broken door just as the cabin door creaked open. A tall figure stepped in, face hidden by shadow. It didn't speak, but moved with unnatural silence. I held my breath, heart hammering. The figure scanned the room, then turned and left, disappearing into the fog. When it was safe, I slipped out the back and ran. I didn't stop until the trees thinned and I saw the headlights of a distant road. I flagged down a car and called the park rangers, reporting the cabin and my experience. They sent a team to investigate, but found nothing. The cabin was gone, as if it had never existed. No footprints, no signs of passage, only the faint scent of damp wood and something unexplainable lingering in the air. I never went back to that forest. Sometimes when the wind is just right and the night is very still, I swear I can hear tapping, footsteps, or whispers carried on the breeze. I've learned to respect the silence, to listen carefully, and to never wander too far into the unknown. Because the forest remembers. Story the end. The forest always held a strange kind of pull for me, something deep and primal that both fascinated and unnerved. Growing up, I spent a lot of time hiking and camping with my family, but as I got older and moved away, the city swallowed me whole. Still, every so often, I'd feel that restless tug, and I'd find myself back at the edge of the woods, drawn by the quiet, the dark, the feeling that the world was different beneath the canopy of leaves. It was early October when I decided to go on a solo trip. I packed a small backpack with essentials: water, some food, a flashlight, a map, and a basic first aid kit. I wanted to camp overnight in a spot I had found a few years earlier, a small clearing beside an old, winding trail deep in the national forest about 2 hours outside the city. The place was quiet, almost untouched, and had a small creek running nearby. I arrived just after noon, parking my car at the small trailhead lot. The place was nearly empty, except for a faded pickup truck tucked in the corner. I figured its owner was probably hiking somewhere nearby. The sun was bright, but the trees cast long shadows on the path. The air smelled like earth and pine, crisp with the first hints of fall. The hike-in was peaceful at first, the trail winding through thick woods and over gentle hills. Birds called above me, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. About an hour in, I came to the creek, its water clear and cool as it babbled over smooth stones. The clearing wasn't far beyond, so I kept moving. When I reached it, the spot felt just as I remembered, an open space surrounded by tall pines and oaks, their leaves just starting to turn gold and red. I set up my tent near the creek's edge and gathered some firewood. As I worked, the sun lowered toward the horizon and the forest grew quieter. No birds, no rustling in the brush, just a deep, heavy silence. Once the fire was going, I sat back on a log and ate a simple dinner. The sky darkened to a deep indigo, and stars began to prick through the thinning canopy overhead. I pulled out my flashlight, intending to read, but the night felt thick, and my eyes were tired. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping coming from just beyond the edge of the clearing. I stopped breathing, straining to hear. The tapping was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking lightly on a tree. It didn't seem natural, and there was something about the rhythm that made my skin crawl. I stood and shone my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the shadows. Nothing moved, but the tapping continued, coming closer. My heart hammered as I realized it wasn't just one tap, it was a pattern, almost like a signal. Tap, 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 pause, tap. I wanted to call out, to say hello, but my voice caught in my throat. The tapping stopped suddenly, replaced by a soft rustling in the leaves. A shape shifted just beyond the light, and for a moment I thought I saw a figure, tall, thin, standing very still. I blinked, and it was gone. I hurried back to my tent, zipped it closed, and sat trembling. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a woodpecker, but the pattern didn't fit. It felt deliberate, human. Sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined the figure waiting just outside, watching. Hours passed. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside. The forest was quiet again, the tapping gone, but a cold, cold dread lingered. Packing up quickly, I followed the trail back to my car. At the trailhead, the pickup truck was gone, no sign of its owner. On the drive home, the forest seemed darker, more oppressive. When I pulled into my driveway, I saw marks on my arms, scratches, thin and shallow, as if someone had reached out to grab me in the night. I never went back. Sometimes late at night, I still hear tapping at my window. Quiet, patient. Story the end. The dense forest stretched endlessly in every direction, a labyrinth of towering pines and tangled underbrush that few dared to enter alone. For years, people in the nearby town whispered about the woods, tales of strange sounds, mysterious figures glimpsed between the trees, and a feeling of being watched. But none of these stories deterred Emily, a young woman who had grown up just beyond the forest's edge. The woods were her refuge, a place where she could escape the chaos of daily life. She knew the trails well and felt at home among the ancient trees. One autumn weekend, Emily decided to spend the night deep in the forest. She wanted solitude, to clear her mind and reconnect with nature before the harsh winter came. She packed lightly, a small tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a lantern. She told no one where she was going, just that she needed some time alone. The sun was dipping low when she arrived at her favorite clearing, a small open space near a gentle stream that whispered over smooth stones. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, covered in moss and lichen. She set up her camp quickly, the ritual comforting after a long day's hike. As twilight fell, she built a modest fire, its warm glow flickering against the darkening woods. Emily settled near the fire, sipping warm tea from a metal cup. The forest around her seemed peaceful, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft murmur of the stream. Yet as night deepened, a strange stillness settled. The usual chorus of nocturnal creatures was eerily absent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She felt eyes on her. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, the natural unease that can come with being alone in the dark. But then, something moved just beyond the firelight. A shadow slipping between the trees, too tall and slender to be an animal she knew. Emily's heart quickened. She picked up her lantern, its weak glow trembling as she aimed it toward the movement. Nothing. She called out softly, "Hello? Is someone there?" Her voice sounded small and fragile in the vast silence. No answer came. The forest seemed to close in, the darkness pressing around her like a living thing. The fire flickered and sputtered as if struggling against an unseen force. Emily tried to steady her breathing, telling herself it was just a trick of light and shadow. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, coming from the edge of the clearing. Nails on bark, claws dragging over wood. The sounds circled her camp, weaving through the trees in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Emily grabbed a sturdy branch from the firewood pile, holding it like a weapon. The scratching stopped abruptly. A faint whisper followed. Too low to understand, but chilling in its tone. She spun, searching for its source. Her lantern caught a flash of movement, long limbs bending at unnatural angles. A figure crouched low, half hidden behind a tree. Frozen in fear, Emily stared as the creature's eyes reflected the lantern light, large, unblinking, and a pale yellow that seemed to glow from within. It did not speak, but a low guttural sound escaped its throat. Its mouth stretched wide in an expression that was almost a smile, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. The fire flared wildly, and the creature vanished into the shadows. Panic surged through Emily. She scrambled to her tent, fumbling with the zipper, heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would betray her. Inside, she grabbed her phone, the one she had hidden away despite her earlier resolve, and tried to call for help. No signal. Outside, the scratching resumed, slower now, but more insistent. The whispers came again, overlapping in a sinister chorus. Emily's fingers trembled as she grabbed a flashlight and stepped out of the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. The trees were still. The forest was silent. Then, from the far edge of the clearing, a figure stepped into the light. Tall, impossibly thin, with skin pale as death and eyes that held centuries of hunger. It moved without sound, gliding closer, limbs twisting in ways no human should. Emily stumbled back, tripping over a root, her flashlight flickering and dying. She ran, branches slapping her face and arms, heart racing as the forest closed in around her. The creature's presence was behind her, cold and relentless. The rustle of leaves, the breaking of twigs, it followed. Hours later, she burst onto the main trail, collapsing near a ranger's station. The sun was rising, washing the forest in golden light. She never spoke of what she saw to anyone, fearing disbelief or ridicule. But sometimes when the wind howls at night, Emily hears scratching at her window and sees those pale yellow eyes watching from the darkness. And she knows the forest never truly lets go. Story. The end. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania, surrounded by dense, endless forest. The kind of place where you knew every neighbor and kids spent more time outdoors than in front of screens. My best friend, Tyler, and I practically lived in the woods behind our neighborhood growing up. We built forts out of rotting logs and plywood, caught frogs by the creek, and carved our initials into every other tree. Those woods raised us. I never felt scared there, until the year everything changed. It was late October. I remember that because the leaves had already turned a brittle brown and the air had that bite to it, like winter was tapping on the window. Tyler and I were 17, both in that awkward stage of being too old for trick-or-treating, but still young enough to care about Halloween. That year, instead of a party or a haunted house, Tyler wanted to go night hiking. He pitched the idea one night as we sat on his back porch, drinking cheap gas station coffee and watching the wind scatter leaves across his yard. "You ever been out there at night?" he asked. "Not really. I mean, once or twice, but not deep. Why?" He grinned, leaning forward like he was about to tell me a secret. "There's something out there. My cousin Jeff, remember him? Said he saw weird lights last weekend, like lanterns swinging between the trees." I rolled my eyes. "Probably just hunters." Nah, Jeff swears they weren't flashlights. He said they moved too slow. Said he heard music, too. Real faint, like humming. Creeped him out so bad he turned around after 10 minutes. I wanted to laugh, but I'd heard my fair share of weird stories about the forest. Everyone around here had. People sometimes talked about a group of old-timers who lived deep in the woods, off-grid types who didn't like strangers. Others swore there was some kind of cult that met once a year. Most of it was the usual small-town rumor mill. But the way Tyler said it, there was a seriousness behind the grin. So we made a plan. Friday night, we'd pack up a thermos, a couple flashlights, and see if we could find anything weird. It wasn't about proving anything. We were just bored teenagers with nothing better to do. That Friday, I told my parents I was staying the night at Tyler's. They didn't ask questions. Why would they? We'd done that 100 times before. Tyler's dad worked night shifts at the factory, and his mom had passed when he was little. We were on our own. By 10 p.m., we were walking into the forest with our flashlights cutting narrow beams through the black. The first stretch was familiar. We passed the old tire swing we put up when we were 12, the rusted-out pickup someone had abandoned decades ago. But as we went deeper, the forest felt different. The trees stood too still. The wind had stopped, and the only sound was the crunch of our boots on dead leaves. "I think we go this way," Tyler said, pointing toward a thinner trail to the left. "You sure?" "I've got a good feeling. Come on." We walked in silence for a while. I checked my watch. 11:02 p.m. We weren't that far from town, maybe 2 or 3 miles, but it felt like another world. I kept glancing behind us, half expecting to see someone following, though I knew that made no sense. Then, around 11:30, we saw the first light. It was faint, orange-yellow like a candle. At first, I thought it was a reflection from our flashlights, but Tyler killed his beam and pointed. The glow was still there, maybe 100 yards ahead. "You see that?" he whispered. "Yeah." We moved slowly, carefully, each step measured. My heart was pounding, not from fear exactly, more like anticipation. We crouched behind a fallen tree as we got closer. The light was swinging, side to side, like someone was holding it. Then we heard the humming. Tyler looked at me with wide eyes. The sound was melodic, soft, like a lullaby hummed by someone who'd forgotten the words. It sent chills up my spine. We crept forward, crouching low. There was a clearing just ahead, and the light came from its center. We stopped just before the trees opened. What we saw didn't make sense. 3 figures stood in the clearing, each holding a lantern. They were tall, too tall, at least 7 feet. Their heads were covered in what looked like burlap sacks, and their clothes hung off them like they were stitched together from scraps. One of them turned slowly, and even though I couldn't see its face, I felt like it was looking straight at us. The humming stopped. Tyler grabbed my arm. "We need to go." We backed away slowly, but something snapped behind us. A twig, loud in the stillness. One of the figures jerked its head toward the noise. Then all 3 started moving, fast. Not running, exactly, but gliding in long, stiff strides that closed the distance faster than seemed possible. We ran. We didn't think, didn't talk, just ran like our lives depended on it. The trees blurred past, branches clawing at our jackets, roots tripping our feet. I could hear them behind us, the crunch of leaves, the creak of old wood or bone. My flashlight beam danced wildly, catching glimpses of movement. At some point, I realized Tyler wasn't next to me anymore. I stopped, wheezing, trying to listen. Nothing, just the wind, finally back. I turned in a circle, whispering his name. "Tyler, Ty!" Then, from somewhere ahead, I heard him scream. It was short, strangled, cut off mid-breath. I didn't think. I just ran toward the sound, crashing through the brush like an animal. I found a clearing, not the one with the lanterns, but another, smaller. And there he was, lying on the ground. He wasn't moving. I dropped beside him, shaking him. "Tyler, come on, man, get up." His eyes were open but unfocused. He mumbled something, just one word over and over. "Teeth, teeth." That's when I saw the marks. Long, thin gashes ran down his arms and neck, not deep but angry looking. His jacket was torn to shreds. I helped him up, half carrying him as we stumbled back the way we came. It took forever. Every shadow looked like one of them. I kept expecting to hear the humming again. We made it back to Tyler's house just after 2 a.m. I locked the door and pulled every curtain shut. Tyler wouldn't talk. He just sat on the couch, rocking slightly, eyes wide and glassy. I cleaned his wounds as best I could. They looked like claw marks. long, curved, but no animal I knew moved like those things. The next morning, he was gone. I woke up on the floor around 9 a.m. The couch was empty. I checked the whole house, then ran outside, calling his name. Nothing. No note, no tracks, like he vanished into thin air. I told his dad, who called the police. They searched the woods for 2 days, found nothing, not even footprints. They questioned me, of course. I told them what I saw, but you could see it in their eyes. They thought I was covering for something. Maybe a fight gone wrong, maybe drugs. But there was no evidence, so they let it go. Tyler was declared a missing person. That was 10 years ago. I moved away not long after, went to college in Ohio, then settled in upstate New York. I rarely talk about what happened. People don't believe me anyway. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it. But sometimes when the wind is just right and the night's too quiet, I think about those woods. I think about the humming, the burlap masks, the teeth. I still don't know what they were or what they wanted. But I know they're still out there, waiting. Story the end. The summer I decided to go camping alone in the dense woods outside my hometown was supposed to be a simple break from city life. I had grown up near forests, but never ventured deeply into them alone. The idea was to disconnect, find some peace, and maybe come back with a few stories to tell. What I didn't expect was how those woods would change the way I saw the world and myself. I picked a spot that was roughly 30 miles from the nearest town, an area known locally as Cedar Hollow. The forest there was thick, with towering pines and ancient oaks, their branches weaving a canopy that filtered the sunlight into greenish shadows. Locals warned me it wasn't a place for the inexperienced, but I was confident in my survival skills. I had packed my gear, told a friend my route, and headed out early one Saturday morning. The trail started well marked, the dirt path winding through the forest like a ribbon. Birds sang, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves. After about 3 miles, I stopped near a stream to rest and refill my water bottle. The air was cool and smelled of moss and pine resin. It was the kind of serene moment that makes you feel utterly alive. Continuing on, I noticed the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their bark darker and thicker. The trail narrowed and became less distinct. The undergrowth thickened and the sounds of birds quieted. Something about the silence made me uneasy, but I pushed on. As evening approached, I found a small clearing just big enough to set up my tent. The ground was soft, blanketed in pine needles. I gathered some dry wood and started a small fire. The sky overhead was clear, stars beginning to twinkle through gaps in the canopy. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal and thinking about how peaceful it all was. Yet, as the night deepened, the forest seemed to close in around me. The usual sounds of crickets and rustling animals were absent. Instead, there was a heavy stillness that felt unnatural. I zipped up my tent and tried to sleep, but the silence pressed against me, making every small noise, like the crack of a twig or the distant hoot of an owl, seem amplified. Then, just as I was drifting off, I heard something else. A faint whispering carried on the wind, unintelligible but undeniably human. My heart sped up. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and bushes, but I saw nothing. The whispering stopped. I sat back down, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was my imagination or the wind playing tricks. I was alone, after all, and the mind can do strange things in the dark. Suddenly, the fire flickered violently, as if a gust of wind had blown through, though the air was still. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, something slipping between the trees just beyond the firelight. My flashlight scanned the area, but there was nothing there. That's when I noticed the eyes. Multiple pairs, glowing faintly in the darkness, watching me. They didn't blink or move, just stared. My blood ran cold. I stayed still, not wanting to provoke whatever was out there. After what felt like an eternity, the eyes slowly disappeared, retreating deeper into the forest. The next morning, shaken but determined, I packed up and started hiking back. The forest, now lit by the morning sun, seemed normal again. Birds sang, and the breeze carried the familiar scent of pine. But as I followed the trail, I felt those eyes again, watching from the shadows. The whispering returned, soft and almost pleading, but the words made no sense. I increased my pace, heart pounding. Suddenly, I stumbled on a patch of disturbed earth. Kneeling down, I found old, decayed footprints, too large for any animal I knew, with elongated toes and deep claw marks. Fear gnawed at me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, where the safety of civilization washed over me like a warm wave. I never went back to Cedar Hollow, but sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the whispering carried on the wind outside my window. And I wonder what still watches from those dark woods. Story the end. I took a job that wasn't listed on any company website. One of those word-of-mouth contracts you only hear about through someone who heard it from someone else. It was the middle of October, and the weather had started to turn. Rainy days, cold nights, and trees shedding their leaves faster than usual. The job was described simply: forest maintenance and overnight observation at a nature preserve in the Pacific Northwest. I was desperate for money and solitude, and it promised both. When I arrived, the ranger who met me looked tired and thin, like he hadn't slept in weeks. His name was Hal. He gave me a set of keys, a printed map of the trails, and a notebook with scribbled entries that didn't follow any real structure. No printed welcome packet, no rules posted on the wall. Just the words, "Don't stay past 5 nights." I asked him what that meant, and he said, "You'll see." The forest was sprawling, thousands of acres of dense pine, sharp inclines, and narrow switchbacks that coiled around the base of jagged cliffs. My cabin was a single-room structure about 5 miles from the nearest road. No electricity, just propane for heat and a hand pump for water. I was told to log wildlife activity at night, note any unusual occurrences, and radio in once each morning. That was it. The first night was uneventful. I walked a short loop around the cabin before sunset and saw nothing but squirrels, a few deer, and one owl that swooped overhead like a shadow. At night, I sat inside the cabin, jotting down my thoughts in the margins of the logbook. Quiet, cold, uneventful. But just after 2 a.m., I woke up suddenly. I hadn't heard anything specific, but it felt like something had been in the room with me. The lantern had burned low, casting dim shadows that seemed to breathe. I held my breath and waited. Then I heard something outside. It was a light crunch, like someone putting deliberate weight on dried leaves. I sat up and listened, and it came again. Closer. Then silence. I moved to the window and looked out. Nothing, just trees, fog, and a thin layer of frost beginning to form on the ground. I didn't sleep much after that. By morning, I had convinced myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or even a bear. I noted the sound in the book and checked in on the radio. Static. Then a faint voice confirmed my signal, and I went back to pretending I wasn't spooked. The second night was worse. I had barely drifted off when I heard something moving around the cabin again. Not just footsteps, breathing, slow, rhythmic breathing, and something else, tapping. Soft tapping on the side of the wall near the window. Not enough to break the wood, just enough to let me know it was there. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Then, whatever it was, dragged something, maybe fingers, slowly along the outer wall toward the door. I thought about grabbing the hatchet I kept by the cot, but didn't want to make a sound. Then I saw the handle on the cabin door move. Just a little. It twitched, then stopped. Whatever it was, it didn't try to force its way in. It just stood there. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. Breathing, listening, waiting, and then it left. I sat awake until morning, clutching the hatchet in my lap and staring at the door. At first light, I bolted outside. There were prints, not boot prints, not paws. Bare feet, human-shaped, long-toed, but wrong. Too narrow, too long. And they came from the woods, circled the cabin twice, then went back the way they came. I radioed in, but this time no one answered. I considered leaving, but the paycheck was the biggest I'd ever been promised. I told myself I could handle 3 more nights. 3. That was it. On the 3rd night, I kept the lantern burning. I stacked firewood against the inside of the door. I even spread powdered chalk across the floorboards just inside the door to see if anything crossed the threshold. Around 1:30 a.m., the tapping came again. This time it moved from wall to wall, circling me. Tap, tap, scrape. Sometimes fast, sometimes so slow I thought I'd imagined it. And then, silence. I waited. The lantern flickered. Then I heard something I'll never forget. It was my own voice. From just outside the window, it called softly, "Hey, you awake?" I froze. My voice, but wrong, too slow, drawn out, like someone trying to mimic me from memory, but getting the rhythm wrong. The imitation continued. "Open up. It's safe now." I didn't answer. Then it laughed. a dry, papery sound. Then silence again. I backed into the far corner of the cabin and waited with the hatchet in one hand and my back to the wall. No more sounds came that night. When the sun came up, I found that something had left the chalky outline of a handprint inside the door. Just one. Fingers too long, palm too small. The fourth day, I hiked out to try the ranger station. It was locked. The windows were dusty and no car was in sight. Inside, I could see a coffee cup half filled, mold growing up the inside walls, and a trail of black residue leading from the desk to the door. I tried the radio again. Static. I wrote in the logbook, but stopped mid-sentence. I didn't know how to explain what I'd heard. Who would believe me? That night, I kept all the lights off. I thought maybe if I didn't draw attention, it would go away. It didn't. Just past 2 a.m., there was a sound like cloth dragging along the outer wall. Then the window slowly darkened. Something blocked the moonlight. I couldn't see what, just that it was there, standing. Then it moved to the door again. I heard it whisper, "Last night." Then it started scratching. Not violently, just a light, persistent scrape of nails against wood. I put my hands over my ears and closed my eyes. When I opened them, something was standing inside the cabin. It stood just on the edge of the lantern glow. I couldn't see its face, only that it was tall, almost hunched to fit inside, and pale as if it had never been in sunlight. Its limbs were long, bent oddly, and its skin shimmered faintly like it was damp. Then it spoke. Not in words exactly, but I heard them in my head. A thought, not a sound. "You don't leave. You stay. Always." I bolted. I don't remember how I got past it or when I dropped the hatchet, but I ran through the woods for what felt like hours. I didn't use the trail. I just moved. I don't know how I wasn't caught or lost. The forest felt alive, but not in a good way. It was watching me. By dawn, I stumbled out onto a gravel road. A truck stopped. The driver, an old man with no expression, didn't ask questions. He just said, "Another one," and motioned for me to get in. I didn't speak during the ride. Neither did he. He dropped me off at a diner 30 miles away and drove off before I could thank him. I never got paid for the job, never heard back from Hal or the Park Service. When I tried to call, no one answered. When I looked up the area online, the nature preserve didn't show up on any map. It was like it didn't exist. A month later, I got a package in the mail. No return address. Inside was the notebook I'd left in the cabin, pages filled with my writing, but also pages I never wrote. They were scrawled in black ink with jagged handwriting, repeating the same sentence over and over. 5 nights. That's all you get. I burned the notebook. I don't go near forests anymore. Even the sound of wind in trees makes my stomach turn. Sometimes, late at night, I hear tapping. I tell myself it's nothing, but once a week ago, I heard a whisper at my window, my voice again. "Open up, it's safe now." Story the end. It was early October when I agreed to take the job with the Forestry Service. Temporary trail maintenance, 3 weeks in the woods. No tourists, no hikers, no reception, just silence, trees, and me. I wasn't exactly outdoorsy, but I needed the paycheck, and something about getting away from the city and its suffocating noise sounded appealing. The area I was assigned to was part of a relatively untouched preserve in the Pacific Northwest. Dense forests, old logging trails that hadn't seen maintenance in years, and a small ranger outpost that would be my home base. I was supposed to check trail conditions, document erosion, and mark any fallen trees for later removal. My supervisor, Tom, dropped me off on a chilly Monday morning. He was scheduled to pick me up after 3 weeks, unless I radioed in sooner for extraction, which I was only supposed to do in case of emergencies. The outpost was small, just one room with a cot, a wood stove, and a radio that only worked during certain hours. It was the kind of silence you notice immediately, not just the lack of cars or people, but even birds seemed to go quiet after a certain hour. I chalked it up to the thickness of the woods. The trees swallowed sound like water. The first few days went by without much issue. I'd wake up at dawn, strap on my pack, and head out along a different trail each morning. There were no real signs of danger. I noted a few fallen trees, some washed-out paths, and the occasional old animal print in the mud. I didn't see another soul, and to be honest, that was what I wanted. But on the 4th day, I found something strange. It was a clearing deep off-trail, definitely not on the map. It looked artificial, as if the trees had been cut in a wide circle, maybe 20 feet across. In the center of the clearing was a ring of stones, like a campfire pit, but there was no char, no ash, no signs it had ever been used. And near the stones were piles of small bones. At first, I thought they were animal bones, raccoon or squirrel, maybe a fox, but there were too many. Dozens, maybe more. All piled neatly, arranged even. I stood there for a while, unsure of what I was seeing. I wasn't trained in animal biology, but something about the way the bones were grouped, stacked by size, aligned end to end, didn't feel natural. I took a few photos and marked the location in my notes, telling myself I'd report it when I next checked in. As I turned to leave, I noticed something else. The silence. Not just quiet, utter silence. No wind, no leaves rustling, no birds. I stood still, waiting for some distant noise. Nothing, just the soft pressure of still air pressing against my ears. That night, back at the outpost, I locked the door. I told myself it was just a weird animal sight. Maybe foxes had a den nearby and dragged the bones there. Maybe a hunter had used the site years ago and the bones had collected over time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that. The next day, I made a point to stick to mapped trails. I avoided the direction of the clearing, didn't even want to glance toward it. Around mid-afternoon, I found a broken trail sign I stopped to repair. As I knelt to drive the stake into the dirt, I noticed something wedged under a nearby log. A shoe. Not a hiker's boot. A child's sneaker. Mud-caked and frayed at the heel. It looked old. I picked it up, then immediately dropped it. Something about holding it filled me with a deep, rising nausea. I didn't smell anything dead nearby. No animals, no bags, no trash. Just this small shoe in the middle of nowhere. I left it where it was. When I got back to the cabin, I kept the lights off and watched the forest through the window until it was too dark to see. I didn't cook dinner. Didn't even remove my boots. I just sat there, waiting for something I couldn't name. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal. A bear, maybe. But these were two-footed steps, crunching leaves, slow, deliberate. I sat up on the cot, heart pounding, and looked toward the window. A figure was standing there, just on the edge of the clearing beyond the outpost. The moon was bright enough that I could see their shape. A person, definitely, tall and thin, unmoving. They weren't carrying a light. They weren't calling out, just standing, watching. I didn't move. I don't know how long I sat like that. 10 minutes, maybe longer. Then, slowly, they stepped backward, disappearing into the trees. The next morning, I went out and checked the ground near the window. There were no tracks. None. Just undisturbed soil and leaves. I could have doubted myself. Maybe I was dreaming. But then I saw what was resting on the steps. The shoe, the same child's shoe I'd left out on the trail the day before. After that, things got worse. I tried to radio Tom. Nothing. Just static and the occasional burst of garbled noise. I climbed a ridge that was supposed to have signal. Still nothing. I told myself I'd hike out the next day, early in the morning. 20-plus miles, but I could do it in a day if I moved fast. That night, I heard whispering. It wasn't in my head. It wasn't the wind. I lay in the dark with the blanket over my head and listened as the voices moved outside. Low, murmuring words I couldn't understand. Male and female. Some sounded like children. They circled the cabin, always just out of view, never knocking, never testing the door, just whispering. When I finally slept, it was a shallow, miserable sleep full of black trees and screaming mouths. I started hiking out the next day before the sun rose. I didn't even pack all my gear, just stuffed what I could into my bag and locked the cabin behind me. The trail was hard to follow in the dark, and by mid-morning I'd gone off course more than once. Around noon, I realized I was walking in a circle. Not metaphorically, I found my own boot prints in the mud. I don't know how it happened. I was following my compass, checking landmarks, but somehow I kept returning to the same point, a wide, mossy boulder near a broken tree. After the third time passing it, I sat down and screamed. I don't know if it was out of anger or fear or frustration, probably all three. The woods were wrong. The trails didn't lead where they should. The sun felt like it stayed in one place, barely moving. I kept walking, and by dusk, I came upon a clearing. The same clearing with the bones, but now the stones were arranged differently. Instead of a ring, they were placed in a spiral leading toward the center, where the bones had been stacked into a crude figure. Arms, legs, head, all fashioned from small animal parts. Its face was made from a deer skull, bleached white. It looked right at me, though it hadn't moved. That night I didn't find shelter. I curled under a rocky outcrop and tried not to cry. The forest around me never went dark, just a constant dim twilight that pressed against my eyes. I could hear the whispering again. Closer now. Sleep came and went in shudders. When I woke up the next morning, there were footprints around me. Human. Barefoot. They circled the spot where I had slept and led off into the trees. I followed them. I don't know why. Maybe I was out of options. Maybe some part of me thought whoever left those tracks could help. I followed them for what felt like hours. The woods grew thicker, darker, quieter. Eventually I reached a hollow. Trees bent overhead like an arch, and in the center was a structure. Not a cabin, not a shack, more like a crude hut made from branches, bones, and scraps of cloth. Totems hung from the trees around it, bundles of hair, tiny carved dolls, bird skulls tied with string. And there were people, 5 or 6 of them, standing still, facing the hut, all barefoot. Their clothes were torn and dirty, their skins smeared with mud and something darker. They didn't react when I stepped into the hollow, didn't turn or speak. Then slowly, one of them lifted a hand and pointed at me. I ran. I don't know how I found my way back. I didn't follow a trail, didn't check the compass. I just ran. Branches tore at my face. I lost my pack somewhere along the way. By some miracle or nightmare, I ended up back at the outpost. The shoe was there again, sitting neatly on the doorstep. I barricaded the door with the cot and sat in the corner until dawn. The radio worked that morning, just once, a single burst of clear signal. I screamed into the mic, begged for extraction, gave my coordinates 3 times. Then silence again. Tom arrived 2 days later. I heard the chopper before I saw it. When I stumbled out of the outpost, I must have looked like I'd come out of a war zone, filthy, shaking, eyes sunken. He didn't ask many questions, just got me on board and handed me a bottle of water. On the ride back, I asked him something that had been burning in my mind. Has anyone else ever had problems out here? He looked at me for a moment, then said, People talk. Say there's places in the forest that don't belong. Old places. Best to leave them alone. I didn't respond. I just stared out the window at the trees as they slipped beneath us. I never went back. Sometimes I dream of that clearing. Sometimes I hear whispering in the walls at night, and just once, I woke up to find a small muddy footprint on my apartment floor. Story, the end. The first time I went into the forest alone was when I was about 24. It was early spring, just as the snow was melting, and the days were starting to feel longer and warmer. I had been feeling restless for months. My job had been suffocating me, and my friends were all busy with their own lives. I needed to get away, just for a while, somewhere quiet where I could think and breathe. I chose a spot I'd been to a few times before, a small patch of woods about an hour's drive from the city. Not the kind of place most people would consider scary, just an ordinary forest, really, with tall pine trees, a creek running through it, and a few hiking trails that looped back to the parking lot. There was a little clearing near the creek where I liked to sit and read or just watch the water flow. I packed a small bag with a tent, some food, and a flashlight, and told no one where I was going. I wanted the solitude, the silence. I told myself I'd be back the next morning. The drive was peaceful. The roads curved through sleepy towns, the kind of places with one gas station and a diner, the kind of places that seem stuck in time. When I arrived at the trailhead, the parking lot was empty except for one other car, a beat-up old sedan. I didn't think much of it. I set off down the trail, the crunch of my boots on the gravel the only sound. Birds called in the branches, and the air smelled like pine and wet earth. The sky was a pale blue with streaks of pink from the setting sun. I found my clearing, set up the tent, and built a small fire. The creek gurgled nearby, its sound soothing. I ate some trail mix, drank water from my bottle, and settled in with a book. As the sun disappeared, the forest darkened quickly. I lit my flashlight and sat by the fire, letting its warmth chase away the chill. It was peaceful. I felt at ease. But then I heard it. A low sound, like a whisper or a sigh, coming from deeper in the woods. I paused, listening. The wind didn't seem to be moving much. The sound came again, soft, almost like someone breathing. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the noise didn't sound like any animal I knew. The fire flickered, casting long shadows, and I realized how isolated I really was. No cell service, no way to call for help. I tried to focus on the book, but the whispers kept coming. Sometimes they seemed to circle me, drifting closer and then farther away. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to feel uneasy. As the night deepened, the whispers grew louder and more frequent. I shined my flashlight into the trees, but all I saw were branches swaying in the breeze. Suddenly, a twig snapped to my left. My heart jumped. I swung the flashlight beam toward the noise, and for a split second, I thought I saw a figure, a tall, thin shape standing just beyond the tree line. But when the light fully hit the spot, it was empty. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a shadow formed by the fire. I decided to go to bed, even though sleep felt impossible. I zipped myself into the tent and lay on my sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds. The whispering stopped, but something else began. A rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking gently on a tree. I held my breath. The tapping stopped. Then it started again, coming closer. I felt frozen. My mind raced, but my body wouldn't move. After what felt like an eternity, the knocking faded away. In the morning, I packed quickly and left, eager to get back to civilization. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the forest edge. A few weeks later, I told a friend about the experience. She said the forest was known locally for strange occurrences, and some people believed it was haunted by the spirits of people who'd vanished there over the years. I laughed nervously, but part of me wondered if she was right. Months passed. Life went back to normal, but I never forgot that night. Then last fall, I returned to the same forest with a group of friends for a weekend camping trip. I wanted to face the place again, to prove to myself it was just my imagination. We arrived early afternoon and set up camp near the creek. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear. We spent the day hiking and telling stories around the campfire. That night, as the fire died down, one of my friends noticed something strange. A series of small piles made of twigs and rocks arranged in odd patterns near the tree line. They looked like crude symbols or markers. We joked about them, calling them forest graffiti, but there was an edge of unease in the air. Later, while everyone else slept, I stepped away from the fire to take a walk by the creek. The moon was bright, and the water sparkled. I thought I heard whispering again, faint and distant. I stopped and looked into the shadows. There, between the trees, I saw the same tall figure I thought I'd imagined years ago. It stood motionless, watching. I blinked, and it was gone. I hurried back to camp, my pulse pounding. When I told the others, they said I was just tired and that the forest played tricks on your eyes at night. But then, in the morning, we found more of those twig piles around our campsite, placed where no one could have put them during the night. One of my friends wanted to leave immediately, saying she felt unsafe. The rest of us agreed. As we packed up, I caught a glimpse of movement in the trees, something watching just beyond the edge of the clearing. We drove away without looking back. Since then, I avoid that forest. I tell myself it's nothing but superstition, that the things I saw were shadows and tricks of light. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear whispering and tapping, and I wonder if something followed me home. Story the end. The air was crisp and cold as Sarah pulled on her boots, the soft crunch of fallen leaves underfoot filling the quiet morning of early November. She was alone, as she preferred it. For years, the city noise had worn her down, and her therapist had suggested something radical. Spend a weekend alone in the forest. No phone, no distractions, just nature and her thoughts. She had chosen a remote section of the Appalachian woods, far from the nearest town, where the trees grew tall and dense, and the trails were seldom traveled. She packed lightly, with a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a map that had seen better days. Sarah was confident in her ability to navigate. Hiking was something she had done often, though never quite this remote. Her plan was simple: hike in Friday afternoon, set camp near a small stream she'd read about on an old blog, spend Saturday exploring the woods, and Sunday morning head back. The first miles were beautiful, almost too perfect in their peacefulness. The sun filtered through amber leaves, painting the forest floor in shifting golds and reds. The air smelled of wet earth and pine needles. She felt her chest unclench with every step. The world she knew, the buzzing electronics, the relentless chatter, slipped away with each stride. She made good time and found the stream just as dusk approached. It babbled gently between moss-covered rocks, and the air carried the faint scent of damp wood and fresh water. Sarah chose a flat spot under a cluster of birch trees, pitched her tent, and built a small fire with dry twigs and fallen branches. The flames crackled, throwing soft shadows against the trees. As night fell, the forest's symphony shifted. The birds were silent, replaced by the distant hoot of an owl and the occasional rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Sarah ate a simple meal of canned beans and crackers, savoring the solitude. After cleaning up, she zipped into her sleeping bag and pulled the tent flap closed, leaving a small window open for the night air. The forest at night was a different world. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, swallowing the shapes and colors she had known that afternoon. Even the familiar sounds felt strange. Somewhere not far away, an animal howled. A low, mournful sound that made her stomach tighten. She told herself it was a coyote. Coyotes were common here. Still, she felt a prickling unease. Just as she was drifting to sleep, a faint noise stirred outside. It was a soft scraping, like something dragging against tree bark or leaves. Sarah froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, slow and deliberate. She held her breath and whispered, "Hello?" No answer, just the scraping. Her heart began to pound. Probably a branch, she told herself. But the sound moved closer, circling the tent. Her flashlight lay on the ground just outside the flap. She debated grabbing it, but felt frozen. The scraping stopped abruptly. Minutes passed. Then, unmistakably, a low, guttural growl vibrated through the air. Sarah's pulse surged. She grabbed her flashlight and swung the beam outside. Nothing. Just the gnarled trunks of birch and oak trees. Then the growl turned into a rough, breathy, rasping, like someone or something struggling to breathe. Her mind raced. Maybe a sick animal, she whispered to herself, though it sounded weak. Suddenly, a dark shape moved between the trees, just outside the light's reach. Sarah blinked. The figure was tall, but not quite human. It hunched oddly, its limbs too long and thin. She swallowed hard. The flashlight flickered and died. Panic bubbled up inside her. She yanked the tent flap open and stumbled outside, fumbling to restart the light. The shape was gone. The forest was still, save for the gentle murmur of the stream. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She didn't want to admit it, but the hairs on her arms stood on end. She decided she wouldn't sleep again tonight. Instead, she gathered the firewood into a pile, trying to coax flames back to life. The forest seemed to watch, silent and endless. As the fire sputtered back to life, Sarah wrapped her arms around her knees, listening to the night sounds. The growls didn't return, but the sense of being watched persisted. Then she heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, crunching on the dry leaves. They circled her campsite, slow and patient. Sarah grabbed her knife, clutching it like a lifeline. The footsteps stopped. A breath. Cold air brushed her cheek. She turned sharply. Eyes, too bright and too close, reflected in the firelight. A low, rasping voice whispered, "Leave." Sarah screamed and bolted into the woods, the underbrush scratching her face and arms. Behind her, something pursued. Not running, but gliding silently over the leaves. Her lungs burned as she ran, every instinct screaming to find safety. She didn't know how long she fled before the forest opened to a small clearing, bathed in moonlight. She collapsed, shaking, chest heaving. There in the clearing was an old stone marker, worn and cracked. Carved into it was a symbol she didn't recognize, a twisted tree with eyes. A chill ran down her spine. Suddenly, a voice came from the shadows, calm and cold. "This is the boundary." Sarah scrambled back, terrified. The voice continued, "No one crosses without paying the price." The forest grew darker around her. She ran again, not daring to look back. At dawn, she found the trail, exhausted and shaking. Back in town, she searched for answers. Locals told stories of the Warden of the Woods, a spirit said to guard the forest's secrets, punishing those who lingered too long. Sarah never returned to the forest. But sometimes, in the quiet of her apartment, she hears the scraping at the window. And in her dreams, the eyes of the twisted tree stare back. Story the end. The day started out like any other when Ethan decided to take a weekend alone in the forest. He had been feeling overwhelmed by the noise of the city, constant traffic, crowds, flashing screens, and the relentless pressure at work. The idea of trading it all for quiet, fresh air and the embrace of towering trees seemed like the perfect antidote. He found a trail deep in a national forest that promised solitude, with campsites tucked away where hardly anyone ventured. It was late September, the air crisp with the first hints of autumn, and the leaves were just beginning to turn. Ethan packed light but prepared: a tent, a sleeping bag, a small stove, some canned food, water, and a reliable flashlight with extra batteries. He didn't bring a phone. He wanted to disconnect fully. The first day was peaceful. The trail was lined with maples and oaks, the ground blanketed in crunchy leaves, birds called overhead, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden beams. Ethan hiked steadily, stopping occasionally to take pictures or rest by a babbling brook. He reached his intended campsite in the early afternoon, a clearing near a small, still pond. The water reflected the sky like glass, surrounded by dense thickets and towering trees. Setting up his tent, he felt a swell of satisfaction. This was exactly what he had needed. As evening came on, Ethan built a small fire, watching the flames flicker and spark. The forest seemed to hold its breath at sunset. The usual chatter of animals quieted, replaced by a heavy, still silence that settled over everything like a blanket. After eating a simple meal and tidying up, Ethan lay in his sleeping bag inside the tent. The crackling of the fire was distant now, and the night was thick with darkness. Somewhere in the forest, an owl hooted mournfully, and the wind whispered softly through the branches. It was around midnight when Ethan was roused from a light sleep by a faint scratching noise outside his tent. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against the underbrush, but the sound was deliberate, slow, and seemed to circle around him. His heart rate quickened. He reached for his flashlight but hesitated, telling himself it was nothing. The scratching grew louder, mixed now with a low, guttural growl that didn't sound quite natural. The air around him seemed to thicken, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. Ethan unzipped the tent cautiously and aimed his flashlight into the trees. Nothing moved in the beam except the swaying leaves and the rough bark of ancient trunks. But then, from the darkness beyond, a shape emerged. At first, Ethan thought it was a man, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes that blended into the night. But the figure moved strangely. Its limbs were elongated, its movements jerky, almost unnatural. Its head twisted slowly, as if disconnected from the rest of its body. Ethan's breath caught. The eyes, large, luminescent, and unblinking, locked onto his. A guttural rasp echoed from the figure, chilling Ethan to his core. Frozen in place, Ethan dropped his flashlight, the beam cutting erratically through the darkness. The figure didn't approach, but it didn't retreat either. Then, other shapes appeared from the shadows. Dozens of them, all similarly twisted, silent. Panic surged. Ethan scrambled to his feet, fumbling for his backpack. The fire in the clearing sputtered and died, plunging everything into darkness. He grabbed his flashlight again and stumbled into the trees, branches slapping his face and arms. Behind him, the sounds of those creatures followed, soft footfalls, guttural growls, and the scraping noise, now everywhere. Ethan ran blindly, desperate to find the trail or any sign of human presence. The forest seemed to close in around him, trees towering like dark walls. Minutes, or maybe hours later, he stumbled into a small clearing bathed in moonlight. There, an old wooden cabin stood, its paint peeling and windows boarded. Ethan's lungs burned, but he didn't hesitate. He ran to the door, which was unlocked. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Dust floated in the beams of moonlight filtering through cracks. On the wall hung a faded photograph of a family smiling on a front porch, decades old. On a table lay a notebook filled with scrawled handwriting and strange symbols. As Ethan flipped through the pages, the scratching noise returned, this time at the windows. He pressed his back to the wall, heart hammering. The voices came next. Whispers, soft and urgent, in a language he didn't understand. A shadow passed behind the thin curtains. Ethan knew he couldn't stay. Grabbing the notebook, he slipped out the back door and ran. The creatures were waiting, but as he broke through the tree line and saw the first signs of dawn, they vanished. Exhausted, Ethan collapsed on the forest's edge, gasping for breath. When he returned to civilization, he researched the area. Locals told tales of disappearances, strange lights in the woods, and an ancient guardian that protected the forest from outsiders. Ethan never returned. But sometimes, late at night, he hears faint scratching at his window, and the glowing eyes of those creatures haunt his dreams. Story the end. I'm going to tell you about a night I spent deep in the forest, the kind of forest that seems to stretch on forever, untouched and unwelcoming. I've always been drawn to that kind of solitude, but that night changed how I think about being alone out there. It was late September, the kind of late summer when the days still feel warm, but the nights start carrying a cold edge that makes the skin crawl just a little. I was out hiking alone, something I'd done many times before, usually without incident. This time, I had a plan to spend a full night in the woods, camp near a small lake, and just be there until dawn. I picked a spot in a national forest in upstate New York. The area was known for its thick pines and old hardwoods, and it wasn't heavily trafficked. I got to the trailhead just after noon and set off on the path that led to the lake. The first few hours were peaceful, the kind of quiet you only get deep in the woods, where the sounds of civilization fade completely. Birds called here and there, and a squirrel scurried off when I stepped too close to a fallen log. Around mid-afternoon, as I was nearing the lake, I started noticing things that didn't quite fit. At first, it was small, broken twigs on the ground, but not crushed like by animals or my boots. They looked like someone had bent them down and let them snap back. I saw some odd scratch marks on a tree trunk, long and vertical, almost claw-like, but too neat to be natural. I brushed it off. Sometimes the forest just looks that way. I reached the lake by 4 p.m. It was a small, still pond surrounded by tall trees, their reflections sharp on the glassy surface. I picked a clearing not far from the shore to pitch my tent. As I worked on setting up, I heard a faint rustling off in the bushes, maybe 20 yards away. It wasn't wind or animals, more like something moving deliberately. I froze, listened. Nothing. I shrugged it off again, maybe a deer or some other forest creature. By the time my tent was up, the sun was dipping behind the trees and the shadows stretched long. I made a small fire pit with stones I found nearby and gathered some dry wood. The first sparks of the fire flickered as the light faded, and the forest grew darker and colder. I settled down near the fire with some canned food and my water bottle. The firelight danced on the trees, casting long shadows. That's when I noticed that the rustling had started again, closer this time. Not far from the edge of the firelight, maybe 10 yards away. I squinted into the darkness but could see nothing. Then I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Too heavy to be an animal. I wasn't alone. I tried to stay calm. I told myself it was probably a hiker like me, maybe camping further down the trail. But there had been no other cars, no other footprints at the lake. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the sound. Nothing but trees. The breathing stopped. The forest went silent. I stared into the dark for what felt like minutes. Then I noticed something at the edge of the clearing. A figure. Standing still, barely moving, just watching. I wanted to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure stepped forward, into the firelight. It was a man, dressed in dirty, worn clothes that looked like they'd been through years of weather. His face was pale, with dark, sunken eyes. His hair hung in greasy strands. There was something wrong about him, not just the way he looked, but the way he moved. Slow, deliberate, almost like he was gliding. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. He raised a finger to his lips in a silent shush, then took a step closer. "Who's there?" I finally managed to whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached down and picked up a rock from the ground. His eyes locked on mine, unblinking, and he threw it into the fire. The rock hit the flames and instantly hissed and steamed. The fire flared up, sending sparks flying into the air. Then, without another word, the man turned and vanished into the darkness. My heart was pounding. I grabbed my pack and flashlight and tore down the path toward the trailhead. I didn't stop until I reached my car hours later, completely exhausted and frozen cold. I never told anyone what happened, not even my closest friends. Part of me thinks I imagined it, or that the forest played tricks on my mind. But there's one thing I can't explain. When I got back to my apartment, I found a small wet rock on my windowsill. It looked just like the one the man had thrown into my fire. Story the end. The forest was a place I had known my whole life. Growing up on the edge of a small town in the Pacific Northwest, the thick evergreens and moss-draped branches were as familiar to me as my own backyard. My parents often warned me to stay on the trails, especially as the days grew shorter in fall. But like most kids raised there, The woods were a playground, a refuge, and sometimes a puzzle. It was the fall before my senior year of high school when I had my first real encounter that changed how I viewed those trees forever. The leaves had turned a muted gold and orange, and the smell of damp earth lingered in the chill air. That weekend, my friend Josh invited me on a camping trip deeper into the forest than we'd ever gone before. The plan was simple: hike in Friday afternoon, set up camp, spend the night, and hike back Saturday evening. We met after school on Friday, packed up our gear, and took the old logging road that twisted and turned miles into the heart of the forest. By the time we found a clearing big enough to pitch our tents, the sun was already sinking behind the mountain ridges, casting long shadows between the trees. Josh had brought an old, beaten-up guitar, a lantern, and enough food for both of us. As we set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest around us was quieter than usual. The usual chatter of birds was absent. No rustling of squirrels or distant howls of coyotes, just silence. We built a small fire, and I started peeling back the layers of my jacket, trying to keep warm. Josh strummed a few chords on his guitar, singing softly. The sound echoed strangely between the trees. It felt like we were alone, but the woods themselves were watching. I remember staring into the fire, watching the embers glow and die down. At one point, I noticed a movement beyond the light's edge, a figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was gone. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Josh shrugged. "It's probably just a deer or something." But I knew what I saw wasn't a deer. Night deepened. We took turns watching the fire, and I tried to stay awake, though the cold seeped into my bones. Around midnight, a strange noise stirred the forest, a soft humming, almost melodic but distant, like a lullaby sung in a language I couldn't understand. It drifted through the trees and around our campsite. I asked Josh if he heard it, but he said no, or that he thought it was just the wind. I wanted to believe that too, but the sound seemed purposeful. The humming grew louder and then suddenly stopped. At that moment, the fire flickered violently and went out. Our lantern, resting on a log nearby, died instantly. Pitch black swallowed us whole. My heart hammered as I reached blindly for my flashlight. Josh fumbled next to me, whispering, "Stay calm, stay calm." When I finally switched it on, the beam barely cut through the darkness. But then I noticed them, eyes, dozens of them, reflecting the light from all around the clearing. They weren't animal eyes, though. They were too large, too still, glowing with a strange amber hue. Frozen, I scanned the trees around us. Something was out there. Something watching. The humming returned, closer this time, surrounding us in a circle. Josh grabbed my arm, voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." I nodded, and we packed up as fast as we could. The eyes seemed to follow every movement. Branches snapped somewhere behind us. We didn't look back. The hike out was the longest and most terrifying I've ever experienced. The trail seemed to stretch endlessly. Every shadow flickered. Every whisper of wind sounded like a voice calling my name. When we finally burst through the last line of trees and into the empty road, dawn was just breaking. The forest behind us looked peaceful, normal, as if nothing had happened. I tried to forget that night. Told myself it was just my imagination, exhaustion, maybe some prank Josh had planned. But the next day, when I looked at the pictures we took, there was one that chilled me to the bone. A blurry figure, standing just beyond the firelight, eyes glowing in the dark, staring directly at the camera. No one I told believed me. They said it was a trick of the light or a wildlife photo gone wrong. But sometimes when the wind blows just right and the night is silent, I swear I still hear the humming. And I know the forest is still watching. Story the end. It started as a simple weekend getaway, just me and the forest. I'd been craving some peace after months of relentless city life. The noise, the crowds, the constant rush, it all felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. So I decided to escape to a small patch of wilderness not far from where I live, a stretch of forest known among locals as Pine Hollow. It wasn't marked on most maps, and people rarely talked about it, but I'd heard stories. Nothing sinister, just tales of solitude and wild beauty. I packed light, a tent, some food, a flashlight, and a good knife. I told a friend where I was going, just in case. The drive there was short, but felt like stepping into another world. The tall trees lining the narrow road, their branches brushing over like long fingers. When I arrived at the trailhead, the air was cool and smelled of moss and damp earth. The forest was thick, old-growth pines towering above, and their needles softening the sounds around me. Birds called occasionally, but otherwise it was quiet. So quiet I could hear my own breath. I started down the narrow dirt path, feeling that mix of anticipation and calm that comes with being surrounded by nature. The trail twisted and turned, climbing up a gentle hill before leveling out near a small stream. The water was clear, tumbling over rocks and fallen branches, and I paused to fill my bottle. I noticed a few old footprints near the bank, large, uneven, like someone had come through recently. That wasn't unusual, but they looked different, almost human, but not quite. I shrugged it off. Maybe a hunter or another hiker. By late afternoon, I found a clearing surrounded by thick underbrush, perfect for setting up camp. The sun filtered through the trees in golden shafts, warming the cool air. I pitched my tent and gathered firewood, the forest growing quieter as the light faded. As darkness settled, the forest came alive with new sounds, the rustling of small animals, the snap of twigs in the distance. I built a fire and sat close, the orange glow pushing back the shadows. I ate my dinner, trying to ignore the creeping feeling that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate crunching of leaves just beyond the firelight. I froze, listening. It was slow, careful, as if someone was stalking through the underbrush, avoiding the dry twigs. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam through the trees, but saw nothing. The crunching stopped. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or a raccoon, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. I retreated into my tent, zipped it up, and lay awake, eyes wide in the dark. The forest seemed to press in closer, the sounds muffled except for the occasional distant snap. Then, from just outside, came the slow, deliberate breathing, heavy and ragged. It was not the breathing of an animal. I held my breath, heart pounding, clutching the small knife I kept in my sleeping bag. The breathing grew closer, and then a whisper, barely audible, "Not safe." I didn't respond. The sound faded, and the forest slipped back into silence. Morning came slowly, with a pale light leaking through the trees. When I unzipped my tent, I found something chilling, a large, muddy footprint pressed deep into the soft earth just outside my door, barefoot, with long toes splayed wide. I packed up quickly and left the forest behind, the feeling of eyes watching me never quite fading. I never returned to Pine Hollow. Story, the end.